My 60 Years on the Plains, Chapter 23. The next day we returned to Little York, where the news of our victory over the Indians had spread like wildfire. A letter came to the mayor requesting us to go to Hangtown, now called Placerville, where volunteers would be enrolled, and we went as requested. Great excitement prevailed there, and 60 men were mustered under the command of Bob Williams. We came in contact with the Indians at Bigelow's Lake, where there is a prairie of some extent. The Indians were armed with lances, bows, and arrows, and some Spanish flintlocks. When we deployed on the prairie, Indians to the number of 150 charged us. We passed through them, wheeled, and recharged, attacking the Indians in the flank. At this they became bewildered, and for they had not expected to be charged in turn. There happened to be 25 men in the company who had served as cavalrymen in the Mexican War. But for that fact, we would have met with disastrous defeat. The volunteers' horses became unmanageable in the yelling and firing that ensued. Through it all, the trappers who had right flank in charge remained together, striking the Indians on their left, where the Indians were 3-1. Led by 2 chiefs and armed in part with lances, they charged us. But the chiefs went down when within 50 yards of us. The Indians, seeing their chiefs fall, halted for a moment, which was fatal to them. The trappers passed through them with their Colt revolvers playing before they had recovered their presence of mind. It was a slaughter. The trappers wheeled and charged the main body of Indians and struck them on the left flank, doubling them up. At this instant, the Mexican war veterans had wheeled and charged with a yell. They were brave men, and if their horses had been trained as ours were, they would have done 3 times the execution they did. As it was, the charge they made saved the day to us. There was one tall Indian decorated with all the barbaric splendor of a war bonnet and feathers on a fine horse, who was endeavoring to rally the Indians. The trappers saw at a glance that this chief must be gotten rid of if we were to gain the victory, and we made for the cluster of Indians he was rallying, scattered them, and killed the chief and several lesser ones. When you put a quietus on a chief, you have a battle won. The Indians beat a hasty retreat up the valley where their village was located. Russell's horse went down in this charge, but he secured the Indians' horse and soon overtook us. In rounding a bend, we came upon the packed train of mules. About 65 Indians who had passed through the village were at their heels. The old men and the women who had witnessed the battle and its results had abandoned the village and taken to the mountains. We burned the village and everything it contained, collected the mules and ponies, and returned to the battlefield. Only 40 of us followed the Indians to their village, and in this running fight, the superiority of our Sharps rifles became again apparent. When we began fighting, we had 40 rounds of ammunition, and when we came out we only had 3 to 7. Captain Williams gave them the credit for gaining the victory, but there's no doubt in my mind that it was due to the Colt revolvers. The captain remarked that he had seen lots of cavalry service, but had never seen such well-trained horses as ours. I rode my Kentucky horse, Otto, and came near losing him, for a bullet passed through his ear. Perkins' horse died from wounds. Scotty's horse fell at the first charge, but he quickly found another mount. Scotty was a hero in a fight, quick as a flash, cool and collected under the most trying circumstances. 6 of the Mexican veterans and 2 miners fell in the fight. Many of these volunteers were poor horsemen and had never fired a pistol before. They were brave enough, but they could not control their horses. For such an engagement as we had just had, constant drill in the use of arms and in horseback riding was required. We had buried the 8 men who had fallen when 30 men arrived as a reinforcement. It was amusing to see these new arrivals scalping the Indians. The trappers showed them how to accomplish it, and they were apt scholars. Some of the trappers had received slight wounds. The only thing that annoyed them was getting blood on their buckskin suits. Buckskin is hard to clean. A council was held to consider whether to follow up the Indians or not. Finally, the captain concluded that this chastisement would prevent them from molesting any more whites. We started on our return trip and reached Hangtown without further trouble. The owner of the mules, who lived in Marysville, was notified to come and get his property. News had arrived that the Indians in Shasta and Trinity counties were hostile, and while we were absent, had committed what is known as the Trinity Massacre, slaughtering right and left, men, women, and children. Volunteers had been called for, and the captain with his old soldiers, as well as we trappers, joined the forces. When we reached Shasta City, we found everyone scared nearly to death, and there were many families there. Those Indians are known as tarheads, and they received a just chastisement when in less than 30 days more than half of them were placed hors de combat, which put a quietus on any further development on their part, devilment on their part. The Indians' commissioners gathered the remnant of them, and they became wards of Uncle Sam. We remained in this section until 1855, when we took part in the wind-up of the Rogue River War. The volunteers were commanded by General Lamrick, who received his appointment through political influence. He understood nothing about military tactics and less about Indian fighting. In 1856, the Modoc War broke out. 3 companies were called out, and we belonged to what was known as the Buckskin Rangers. Our commander was General Crosby, a third-rate lawyer who also received his appointment by a political pull. He was a counterpart of Lamrick in knowledge of Indian fighting. Neither of them ever went into an engagement. At the close of the Modoc War, the Pitt River Indians committed the Pitt River Massacre, and the 3 companies went after them. After annihilating about half, the remainder surrendered and were placed on a reservation. The volunteers were disbanded, but we trappers remained together, mining a little until 1858. In the spring of that year, Perkins, Noble, Dockett, Evans, and Scotty concluded to go to New Mexico. Russell remained with me. We all promised to meet again, but never did, although we often corresponded. About this time, there was great excitement over the discovery of gold on Fraser River in British Columbia, and for a while it looked as if the stampede would deplete California of her mining population. Pack trains were rushing to Dallas, Oregon, to pack supplies to the miners on the river. Don Alvarez, a Chilean, engaged Russell and myself to guide him and his 2 pack trains from Eureka to Dallas. We took the east side of the Cascade Range, as grass was reported scarce on the west side. This route took us through the Modoc country by Klamath Lakes, but we experienced no difficulty, and it was evident that the Indians had cooled down for a while at least. When we arrived at Dallas, we met some officers from Walla Walla who told us the commander wished to employ some experienced scouts. We were offered good pay to accompany a pack train to Fraser River, but declined, preferring to visit Fort Walla Walla. When we reached the fort, we saw a number of Nez Perce Indians on the parade ground surrounded by officers. We attracted considerable attention owing to our fringed buckskin and moccasins. The Indians immediately asked us in sign language where we'd come from. We answered in signs, much to the astonishment of both officers and Indians, who did not expect such proficiency from us. Colonel Wright, the commanding officer, invited us to his office and asked us many questions, which we answered truthfully, after which he engaged us as scouts. Some little time before we reached the fort, the Yakimas, Spokane, and Colville, and other tribes had declared war. Colonel Steptoe met the Palance and Spokane tribes and was defeated. Lieutenant Caston, a nephew of General Scott, lost his life in this battle. The Nez Perce came between the hostiles and troops and saved the latter from being slaughtered. Colonel Wright had succeeded Colonel Steptoe by order of General Harney, who in turn had succeeded General Wool as commander of the Pacific coast. There had been a lull in Indian affairs, and Colonel Wright was anxious to find out, if possible, what the Indians were doing and how many warriors they could muster. This was a difficult problem for us to solve as we were strangers in the country. End of chapter 23.